All right. So while we're getting this set up, good afternoon, almost good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elliot Seeger, and I've been delighted to meet so many fascinating people here and have some really inspiring and interesting conversations, which is probably why I'm on the verge of losing my voice at this point. But I have been in the monitoring, evaluation, learning, impact space, and humanitarian contexts for longer than I'd like to admit at this point, doing some work across Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Sudan, and a few of those great places to visit right now. And I am very lucky now to be collaborating with Malin and the Coala team to think a little bit about how we look at some of these more traditional monitoring and evaluation approaches that have been used and implemented for the last 20 years and how we can strengthen those with new emerging technology to make them more efficient, more effective, and ultimately make humanitarian assistance more impactful in some of these complex and more volatile contexts. There we go. All right, thank you. All right, so I've packed a fair amount into this, so please forgive me, but we're going to run through it, and hopefully it'll be a good reference if you'd like to have access to it later. And so I'm going to focus a lot on what we've learned and a lot of our failures and a lot of our gaps in the systems that we have and how we're trying to address that going forward. So what is monitoring and evaluation in humanitarian contexts? And I think Anka gave a brilliant presentation yesterday on some of the foundations of this, so hopefully we're going to build on that and talk about some of the more practical implementation. But a USAID administrator once said to me, "Why do you make it sound so complicated? It's just to track what we do, to test what we do, and to talk about what we do." And I think ultimately that rings true in many ways. And so if you talk about monitoring, it's simply the ongoing collection and analysis of data to track and verify that the outputs that we're trying to deliver are actually happening and there aren't ghost schools and we're not missing 10 meters of pipeline or all of these other things that have indeed happened. Evaluation is systematically testing the effectiveness and efficiency of impact, usually after humanitarian action has occurred. And then learning is an ongoing practice that we try to integrate and build into all of our different systems using more technology and feedback and listening to the communities and the people that we're working with to try and improve our systems in real time and as we go forward. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. This is a kind of fun framework. And it's very relevant to MEL in the sector because, if you're working on, say, a health intervention that's over 5 years and you're trying to reduce infant mortality by 25% in a specific district, that's fairly easy to develop a MEL framework for and measure impact. But unfortunately, more and more of the contexts that we're working in are either complex, complicated, or chaotic. And what that means is the impact frameworks that we develop and the monitoring systems that we use have to be tailored to those specific contexts, and they have to allow for a bit of flexibility because we don't really know what's going to happen, and things change very rapidly. And we were having a debate yesterday, I think, about which of our sectors has more ridiculous acronyms. And I'm not sure who's winning yet, but one of the ones we have is called CAMEL, which is Complexity-Aware Monitoring and Evaluation and Learning. And I'm sorry that I brought that up, but it does. So we have different layers. So at the activity level, this is, are we effective in providing cash transfers or passing out bags of rice or delivering humanitarian aid? And then at the programmatic and strategic levels, we have to use different methods to assess the context, to determine whether that aid is actually the right aid that we're providing, even if it is verified and is there. Maybe the entire founding or theoretical rationale for that program was flawed from the get-go. So it's important to have a multi-layered MEL approach whenever you're designing a program or designing your impact framework. This is the USAID Collaborative Learning and Adaptation Model, CLA, which is all the rage right now, but I think also still has quite a few problems. But the idea is that monitoring, evaluation, and impact measurement is not one-off. It's cyclical, it's iterative, and it has to continue to occur in a rapid process over the course of all the projects that we're working on. So theories have changed, and I think Anka really did a good job at explaining these yesterday. But very simply, it's if we do X, then Y will occur because of Z. And I think this because of Z aspect is the most important because that's our assumptions. And we need to continuously test our assumptions to make sure that they're actually accurate. And that requires different methodologies and different impact assessments depending on the type of humanitarian program that you're working on. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I wanted to just give you some examples of what these theories of change look like in practice. This is a project that I'm working on right now in the border areas between Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, trying to improve peace building. And you see, it's all nice and clean and fairly linear, and our project is not going like this at all. But it looks good on paper. So, best intentions, I think. And down here also, these are the assumptions that I was talking about. And one of them here says, governments maintain political will. That hasn't been the case in our project, and that can actually ruin the entire thing. So this is actually more of an ass-covering exercise in many ways when you're not able to deliver your project and explain to your donor, well, we had this assumption and it didn't really go that way, so we've had to adapt accordingly. Then they can get more complicated. These really annoy me, and I think there's a lot of hubris among humanitarian actors that think that all of this is actually going to occur very cleanly and link up to each other. So I tend to err on the side of simplicity, but just when you run into these, throw it in the bin, I think, is probably the best approach. I think another aspect of our arrogance in the humanitarian sector is what we think that we can control. And so when we talk about impact, a lot of projects will say, oh yeah, we brought world peace to South Sudan, and that was all because of our 2-year, $20 million program. And so I think we need to be very clear about contribution versus attribution is the jargon that they'd use in our sector. And I think if we understand that there are many, many different factors that contribute to the results or outcomes that we're seeing in certain places, maybe ours was a fraction of that, but we need to be clear about what the others are. So as you're developing theories of change, as you're coming up with indicators for those, this is really what we're being held accountable for. And the farther we get out to the outcome and impact level, there's less and less accountability. And so I think it's really important to be realistic and practical as you're working through some of that. So here's some more jargon and another terrible acronym that we have, but I'm sure many of you have seen this before. But when you're developing indicators, they should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And you'd be surprised how many do not fit within this matrix. But I think coming back to simplicity and practicability, this is really important. I'm also not going to take you through the detail of this, but this is just an example of what it looks like in practice. And this is a logical framework we developed for a humanitarian aid program for the UK government in Myanmar a couple of years ago. Also did not go to plan. But we capture it like this in certain ways, and there are a variety of ways to do it. And I think some of the emerging technology we have now will make really boring spreadsheets like this less necessary. And so that's something we're trying to deliver through Coala Pay as well. So when you're looking at indicator development, these are the layers that we usually talk about. And I think Anka would also add activities and inputs to this, but this is oversimplified. But at the output level, we're really looking at verification. And I think when you talk about Web3 and you talk about blockchain, that's really where it comes into its own and has a lot of value to add to the sector in terms of, is it there? Did it get there? Is it being used? What's the quality? All of those things, which are very important. But when you get to the outcome level, you're looking beyond that. So sure, you've provided nutritional support to people that are food insecure in Somalia. Was it the right food? Was it culturally appropriate? Was it sufficient to actually meet their monthly quota or household needs? We talk a lot about plumpy doughs. I don't know how many of you are familiar with kind of nutritional programming, but it's nutrition that's given to kids in these humanitarian contexts that is very high in certain nutrients. And I remember going to a conference where everyone was freaking out because they'd run out of the right plumpy doughs formula. And so someone came up and put up a PowerPoint and said, I've got a new recipe, don't worry, we can do this. And a Lebanese man in the back row just said, oh, so it's hummus. He's like, this is my mother's recipe. Like, why are we spending millions of dollars to look at this? So I think that's really at the outcome level, the kind of thing you want to be testing, because I think we end up spending a lot of money on things that could be simplified and done much more efficiently. And then at the impact level, you're looking at, are we actually adapting to climate situations? Have we created livelihoods? And then building resilience. There's another buzzword that people love to use in our sector, but I don't think anyone's really come up with what resilience actually means in our context. But in a humanitarian context, it often means building back better. So recently there have been very severe floods in East Africa, and we were responding to those through cash transfers to communities in these border areas where their entire livelihoods had been destroyed. But we tried to use those cash transfers also paired with and coupled with livelihoods development initiatives so that in the future they would actually be more shock resistant to those floods going forward. And that's where you need to do more rigorous and robust impact evaluation within those contexts. And so then we have a few different methodologies that are relevant at those levels. So at outputs, direct observation, just did someone see it? Can we verify it's there? Can we use a geotagged photo? Also remote sensing, which I think our colleagues were talking about earlier in terms of GIS, satellite imagery. Can we actually see if IDP camps are growing or if they're shrinking? Can we look at how big the flood area is in a certain area where disasters occurred? When you get to the outcome level, we look at perception surveys. We talk about most significant change, and I think this is quite relevant in conflict settings where you talk to communities about just generally over the last 2 years, 3 years, what's been the biggest change that you've seen in your area? And we take qualitative notes of these, and we've often run AI analysis through there to actually see whether there's any link to the changes that they've perceived in their communities and the projects that we're running. And if we see that there's no link between those two, you've got a problem and you probably need to rethink your design. And then at the impact level, people love to talk about RCTs. And I've contributed to the design of 3 or 4 RCTs in humanitarian contexts, and not a single one of them went to plan. One was for the Danish demining group in Somalia, where they were like, okay, so we're going to provide support to kind of conflict scenarios in these communities, and then have a control group where we don't provide support. And the donors were like, well, that's going to get in the news, isn't it? I don't think, so a lot of them get halted. But if you can do a randomized control trial, and I think if you look at organizations like Give Directly and others, they're doing a lot more in situations that are less volatile, where communities are less mobile, and you can actually get better data on some of that. But other than that, we do kind of theory of change, contribution analysis, and you can do some quasi-experimental methods like difference in difference, depending on the type of humanitarian response that you're looking at. So why does this all matter? In recent years, about $21 million in aid has been unaccounted for in Somalia. I would say this is pretty problematic overall, and people within certain sectors don't seem to worry too much about this. And this also comes back to the governance and political will issue we talked about before, in understanding whether the government in a certain area where there is a humanitarian crisis is really interested in helping you succeed in terms of what you're doing. More recently, I'm sure many of you have been following the conflict in Ethiopia and Tigray. I've been working on this conflict for the last 2 years, running a third-party monitoring program for the World Bank. And the reason that they asked me to come in and do this was they went on a monitoring visit. They opened one of the warehouses that was supposed to have food for starving people in Tigray, and realized that it was completely empty, and food for 1,000 people had 100,000 had disappeared. And they immediately launched an investigation into this, which took 6 months. And so the food aid actually wasn't allowed to be delivered during that 6-month period, and hundreds of people starved in Tigray as a result of that. And the results of the investigation were that actually the local government in Tigray and the Ethiopian national government had stolen that food aid. And so what we've had to do is set up third-party monitoring systems that prevent that from happening in the future, allow for accountability, but also don't piss off the government enough to make them kick us out of the country. And so there's a very kind of tightrope you have to walk in order to achieve that. And part of what we've been doing is remote sensing. We've been using blockchain as tracking and verification. But at some distribution sites, they wouldn't let us bring scales, for instance, to weigh the bag of wheat. They were supposed to have 15 kgs of wheat for each household. So I had to train 30 enumerators to basically just be able to intuitively know what 15 kg felt like by lifting it up. And that way we were actually able to see where the aid diversion was occurring and report it to the local authorities to try and do something about it. So the US government Special Investigation Office has found that 40% of all aid to Afghanistan was mismanaged or diverted, which I think comes to around $31 billion. This photo was taken by one of my team members, And I like it because it's actually, these men are sitting around what's called the Durand Line, which is the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so we were providing aid to communities who were living on the border, who were some of the most vulnerable communities in the world. And my colleague here, we'll call him Bilal for the purposes of this conversation. I've always regretted what I did to him in this situation, but we provided generators on wheels to some of these remote communities so that because there was no electricity, they could use the generators to power drinking water supply systems. And guess what? 2 weeks after we provide the generators, they couldn't find them. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. Why did we put them on wheels? The idea was that they would rotate between the communities. Anyway, so USAID comes to me and says, look, if we don't have a geotagged photo of this bloody generator in the next week, we're shutting your whole program down. And back then, and now I'm dating myself, you couldn't just geotag a photo on your phone. So I had to order 20 of these DSLR cameras that had geotagging capability and give them to our staff to go and try and find these generators on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And turns out all of the cameras have massive satellite icons on the side. And so if the government catches you with a camera in the tribal areas with a massive satellite icon on your camera, you're probably going to get shot or kidnapped. So I had to spend 2 days filing them off with a metal file. And then my colleague Bilal here hid it in his turban, went on a 14-hour drive out to the community where we provided the generator, and found out that, sure enough, the political agent or district administrator had moved it into his house to provide his family with electricity. So he goes into the house, and he very kindly, the district administrator goes to make him tea, and he pulls the camera out, and he's photographing the generator here, and then he takes a 14-hour ride back, and we realized that he wasn't in line of sight of the sky long enough for that geotag location to actually happen. So we had to send him back out, and sure enough, he's abducted for 2 weeks, and we have to start negotiation with local elders to get him out. And he was finally released, but he still has PTSD from that whole experience. And why am I telling you this story? Because we no longer have to do things like this. We've found technological solutions that will allow us to do remote monitoring and remote sensing in these areas, and that actually relies on enabling and empowering communities to report on some of these issues themselves in remote ways, using technology that's going to protect them from government eyes and other types of spying. So that's really encouraging. So I think talking specifically about impact evaluation for cash, this is something that is becoming a growing evidence base. And it's also a little bit controversial, I think, in the humanitarian sector. Because the more and more that cash assistance is proven to be more effective than, say, passing out in-kind distribution or bags of rice, the less relevant a lot of these traditional humanitarian agencies are. So there's a lot of resistance to change in our sector. And I think what we need is to do more evaluation and more impact studies at this level to assess how we can actually distribute aid or cash assistance in some of these scenarios, which will be less expensive. More of the aid will actually end up in the communities that we want to help, and it can be delivered much faster and in a rapid context than we could in other ways. And what that requires doing is market assessments. So, for instance, in Somalia at the moment, there's a drought, and so there's a lot of food aid that's being given. But some communities are saying, actually, we prefer to have cash rather than bags of wheat because our markets are functional, and we're actually able to go out and use that cash. And that also empowers communities to have more control and ownership over how they use assistance that's provided. And I think when we first talked about this 20 years ago, aid agencies were saying, no, if we give people cash, they're going to go spend it on whiskey and cigarettes, and it's not going to have any material impact. And we've seen that that absolutely is not the case. And so pivoting to this has been slow, but it's something that I think is really taking up more traction. And I think when you look at organizations like Stellar and Coala and others, there's a really important use case for how we work with humanitarian organizations to update their systems and to kind of demonstrate that the use case has value and it's also not going to put them out of business. And doing that, I think, requires a little bit of sensitivity and negotiation around that. But it also requires integrating those systems with impact measurement frameworks. And so Yeah, cash and armed conflict is another issue, but we can talk about that a bit later. So right now, this is the proportion of humanitarian aid that's delivered on cash transfers. And I think this is overall way too low. And it also demonstrates that communities are much less empowered than they would be otherwise, depending on the type of assistance that you're providing. So what are the challenges and opportunities? So when you're doing impact assessment in MEL and complex contexts, access is probably the biggest issue. So if you want to survey 3,000 people in southern Iraq, there's no way that's going to happen because enumerators walking around with clipboards or iPads are not going to have very much longevity in that scenario. So how else do you have access? So that comes back to, well, can you do push surveys through some type of digital platform? And can you do it in a way that's not going to put the respondents at risk and safeguard those that you're actually collecting the data from? But this is something that we're still struggling with in most humanitarian crises that we're working on. Cost. So on average, if you're trying to do a representative perception survey in some of these more challenging locations, the cost is going to be upwards of 150 to 300,000 US dollars to have something where you have 95% confidence in that data. So it becomes very expensive. And a lot of that is around the expensiveness of logistics required to actually get data collection infrastructure into some of the communities where you want to hear from people. And because the roads are very poor, because there's no communication infrastructure, you have to spend more and more to actually be able to have trust in the findings that you're doing and to do it in a way that delivers high quality verification of what you're looking at. Ownership. And this is something that really does my head in. But if I'm being honest, all of our humanitarian agencies are essentially doing research on the same topics with the same communities in the same areas over and over and over again. And these communities, will provide you with information, tell you about what their needs are, talk about, what their key issues may be, and then they never hear anything back. So it becomes a very extractive relationship that we have. And also, those organizations are so chuffed with themselves that they managed to get this data that they don't share it with anyone else. So the donors are like, well, what are you going to do? They're like, well, this is our proprietary information. And so if you want to get information on it, get someone else to go to do exactly the same survey next week. And so what that contributes to is what we call respondent fatigue. And what we've seen in a lot of these humanitarian contexts is that communities just don't want to talk to you anymore. You keep taking all this data from them, they're not owning it, they're not seeing what you're doing with it, and they're actually not seeing any material change in their situation as a result. So if that was me, I would just slam the door in their face. So that's something that we need to deal with as well. So what are we thinking about in the Coala Pay context? So I think we've got this amazing payment infrastructure and these collaborations with Stellar and other organizations. And what would be really fantastic is if we could integrate some of these monitoring and evaluation and impact measurement processes into the payment mechanisms themselves to boost efficiency, to decrease cost, and to strengthen ownership of communities over their own data. So what we're building now, and maybe some of you have come across this over the last couple of days, is called the Billy app, which is the name of our koala. And I'm sure you've talked to Chankoko and others, but it does everything from kind of AI-driven LLM conversations with communities that we call community listening. So instead of having a standard push survey that you're pushing out, they can just have more of a natural conversation with you about what the problems are in their locations and how they could potentially be fixed. Those LLMs can also provide them with guidance and insight and advice based on existing data about how they might be able to manage some of this themselves, how they could contact relevant local authorities, or how they could provide feedback if they think that the quality of assistance isn't good, or it's being diverted, or there's any other forms of mismanagement. So that's great. It also provides kind of semi-structured chat functionality to help our clients and donors actually design tailored and bespoke ways of gathering data from communities that can be more nuanced and textured rather than just a quantitative survey. But it also does that too. So being able to push out quant surveys in these contexts is really important as a way of having representative sampling and also being able to do it quick enough to allow for things like early warning. And so I think that's another component of what the Billy app seeks to do, is actually provide donors and humanitarian actors more timely information when a disaster or a shock occurs, because communities can tell you right away. And it's managed also by their local partners themselves. So rather than spending $300,000 on a needs assessment, they have immediate, tangible, actionable information at hand, provided from a reliable source that can be collected digitally without putting enumerators at risk or spending a bunch of money on infrastructure in the field to try and collect that data. And then the goal is to try and flip the system on its head, to give communities control, access, and decision-making over their own information. And part of this is looking at how blockchain can help facilitate that, and how Web3 can help facilitate that. And we know that storing data on the blockchain can be a very burdensome, time-intensive exercise, but new technology around data canisters and other systems actually allows us to do this in a much more efficient, democratized way. And there's going to be pushback and resistance to this because people like being proprietary over their own data. They like spending lots of money on the same survey in the same communities all the time. But we do think that over time, making that information public where we can, focusing on respondent data security, anonymization, will actually create a better relationship between humanitarian actors and the people that they're working with, because they're allowed to give them instant real-time feedback in a meaningful way to improve some of their systems and actually make things more agile and responsive. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for joining.